Good afternoon, everyone. We are back at ETBFSI special series, which is about the budget. Today, specifically in this episode, every year, in fact, we have been talking about what is going to happen in the budget in the month of January. Uh, every Friday, we conduct this show with BFSI leaders trying to demystify how the budget is going to be, how the finance minister is going to react to the situations, and what is exactly the BFSI leaders are expecting from that. Uh, so this becomes a run-up to the scheduled budget, which is in February, 1st of February. And I have three important speakers for this particular session with me. My first speaker is Ms. Sakshi Gupta, the principal economist of HDFC Bank. Sakshi, glad to have you. My next speaker is Mr. Indrajit Kamotra, the MD and CEO of Unity Small Finance Bank. Indrajit, glad to have you.
Thank
And
you,
my next
Amol. Good
speaker
to
is
be on your
Raman
show.
Agarwal, the director of FIDC and the former chairman of FIDC. Raman, glad to have you.
Thank you and namaskar. Thank you for having me.
Great. So let me begin by asking you a very simple question first and learn from you. As you can see, my dear audience and the readers, that we have tried to maintain a diverse panel. We have an economist and we have a banker and we have an NBFC expert who could give us more literature specifically on the SME and the SME and the MSME side, because the business push is going to be there, and that's what the expectation is. So before I begin and ask, shooting you one important question, which is, or a basic question, what are your budget expectations? I think there are, two factors, I think, which goes with the Indian economy rightly. If I look at the positive factors, the current account deficit is slightly improving. Focus on India story is reflecting high in the market. Rural numbers are also improving. Banks are clean. Infrastructure is growing. These are some of the positive factors that the Indian economy is going through right now. But on the negative sides, geopolitical tensions is going to be a big worry. Once Trump takes over and he comes back to the office, we do not know what exactly strategy he will apply, and that is going to be one challenge that the government is also going to look at. Inflation is still very high. Growth rate, and rupee is again a challenge. Private capex is not picking up, and slightly there is an analysis or theory that specifically the stress will rise up in the micro segment or the MSME side. So these are the positive and the negative factors. And amidst this, the government is going to, unleash the potential of the budget on the 1st of February. So let me shoot my first question to you, Sakshi, and learn from you. What are your budget expectations?
Thanks, Amol, and thanks everybody who's joined in. Very happy New Year to everybody. Every year we have the budget, and I think there are a lot of expectations, but this time the budget is very important because, as you rightly highlighted, it is coming on the heels of a lot of global uncertainty, because of what is happening in the US. And I think also with what is happening in India over the last couple of months, right? Inflation has been very, very high. Consumer demand continues to be under stress, although, yes, on the rural side, things seem to be improving. But at a broader macro level, there are still, concerns around how consumption is going to pan out. Overall GDP growth, we saw at 5.4% for the second quarter. And given this backdrop, so I have, I would like to highlight three broad expectations from this budget from the macro side, right? One is, of course, the question of, how the government is going to approach is its, fiscal arithmetic. So are they going to continue consolidating their fiscal math? I would expect the government to continue going down on the path of fiscal consolidation, and target a fiscal deficit which is close to a slightly below 4.5% for next year. This was something that the finance minister highlighted in her last budget speech. And I think that commitment towards fiscal consolidation is going to continue and be reflected in the upcoming budget. I think this is very important now also because India has been included in a number of bond indices, and therefore maintaining good fiscal health and ultimately sustainably bringing down our debt levels has become more important now, right? So that would be my first expectation. The second thing is, of course, within this fiscal, broader fiscal deficit target, I think that the problem this year has been the very slow momentum in government capital expenditure. Right, of course, in the beginning of the year, it was a very slow start because of elections, and but we haven't really seen a major catch up in terms of the capital expenditure bit. Now, I think next year, some of this capital expenditure that is perhaps not going to be delivered this year will spill over. And I think that that will kind of remain one of the very important focus areas for, this budget and for the next fiscal year. When we talk about capital expenditure, I think it is not just fair to concentrate on pure infrastructure spending, which includes spending on roads, railways, etc. But I think now we have to start looking at a broader definition of capital expenditure that
Right.
includes spending on a lot of social aspects like health, education, climate, skilling, employment. I mean, all these expenditures are also, going to ultimately lead to a lot of productivity growth and overall GDP growth in the economy. So I think these aspects will
Hmm.
kind of see a higher focus and greater allocations in the budget this time. Lastly, I think, I do expect that the budget will come out with some amount of counter cyclical support for consumer demand. Now, this could happen through various ways, either through greater focus on creating formal employment or through providing some amount of benefit on the income tax front, particularly for certain income brackets below let's say 15 or 20 lakh rupees.
Right.
There is of course this expectation or calls for making further changes to things like standard deduction, allowing for certain deductions for premiums that are paid on health insurance, life insurance, etc. So there are a whole bunch of avenues that the government could employ. But I do think that there will be some announcements that could help support and increase a more sustained increase on the consumer demand side.
Okay, I think copied your 3 points. I think they're quite important one. Let me come back to you specifically on a couple of specific points there, Sakshi. But let me move to Indrajit and take his expectations. Indrajit, please go ahead.
Thank you, Amol. India is in a very unique position, the fifth largest economy in the world, almost $4 trillion, and poised to get to the third largest, hopefully in about 4 years from now. So, this expectation of a transformational budget this time and setting the pace for the next 3, 4 budgets to come. Specifically, I think tax simplification would be a good place to start. For individuals, always, as Sakshi has pointed out, it will generate more disposable income, and as such, it will drive up consumption. So that's an important target for India. Last year, Finance Minister had simplified capital gains tax. That has made a lot of yeoman way. We are hoping for some more in the same direction. Last on the tax simplification is bringing fuels like petrol and diesel under GST might make sense at this point in time.
Okay.
The second is actually the more important one, which is boosting employment in the intensive sectors which are favorable for India, especially in the MSME, climate impact firms, and all the firms under ESG, IT, and InfoSec. These initiatives will generate jobs, and not only in the urban India, but in the semi-urban and tier 2 cities. That adds a fillip into our rural economy because there's a flow through effect from that point. The last one I would like to talk about is how to enhance rural consumption and food security, especially because of the climate emergency we have been facing of late. You know, once we bolster rural income, which actually is showing signs of recovery very positively over the last 18 months, it will be very sustainable for India. Some very specific things like raising wages under Mahatma Gandhi and Rega to levels maybe 33% above where they are. They're currently 267. We could think of 375. And Prime Minister's Kisan Yojana, payouts are 6,000 a year. We can look at some number in line with inflation to help, the 100 days guaranteed employment. So essentially, I've tried to cover the salaried and the corporate side, the MSME side, and the Bharat part of India.
Right. Uh, Noted your point, Indrajit. In fact, rural and specifically Bharat part, I think needs a lot of attention, and more attention should be there on that side. So thanks for highlighting that. We'll again come back to you for specific questions, but let me move to Raman and take his expectations first as opening remarks. Ramanji, please go ahead.
Thank you, Amol, and happy New Year to all the audience. See, as we move towards the PM's vision of developing a Viksit Bharat, credit and that to this bottom of the pyramid is going to be a very, very important factor. And that is where the sector which I come from, NBFCs, play a key role in credit delivery. So from this budget, the three key expectations and asks from our side have been, there is a strong case to diversify the funding sources for NBFCs, because if you know, RBI had voiced its concern over dependence of NBFCs on bank funding, and as a result, RBI had issued a circular increasing the risk weight of bank lending to NBFCs, which has had its impact that the bank lending to NBFCs has come down. Now, one source, the funding gets restricted, but there has not been a alternative provided. So as a result, what has happened is, if you see the latest trends, and RBI released the data on the ECBs, some of the large NBFCs have started borrowing heavily overseas. So we've seen that in the month of October itself, $5.5 billion were borrowed overseas for on lending in the domestic market. Now, if we are to build an Atmanirbhar Bharat, that is something that needs to change. And the small NBFCs anyway grapple with liquidity because they tend to be dependent on banks. So that is where we asked that there is a need here to create a direct refinance mechanism for NBFCs, just like you have a National Housing Bank for HFCs. So maybe some fund allocation, dedicated funds which is meant for MSMEs, for small borrowers, even for environment friendly assets like EVs and solar rooftops, could be given to SIDBI or NABARD, which could in turn refinance NBFCs. So that's the most first important key asked. And second, of course, now that our regulations, the NBFC regulations have been harmonized with that of banks and other financial institutions, the corresponding harmonization in terms of recovery and taxation is the key. On that front, for example, we have access to SARFAESI, but we cannot enforce security unless the loan size is 20 lakhs, whereas NBFCs give small ticket loans. So the need to remove this rider. And then we have this irritant of, taxation, a 10% TDS on interest income. So every EMI that every non-individual borrower repays to me, he has to deduct 10% TDS, which serves no useful purpose. There is no additional revenue generated. It's no benefit to the borrower. It's no benefit to the lender, and it's causing an operational nightmare. So I think, and we are the only class of financial institutions we are not exempted. So we need to be exempted under Section 194A. So these were the three key asks and three expectations from the budget.
Sure. I think it's an interesting list, and I think to begin with, I hope the finance minister listens to this. But friends, readers, do shoot your questions if you have anything specific as we deep dive into the budget expectations. So Sakshi, let me come back to you. I copied your 3 points specifically, but looking at the current fiscal situation, obviously CAD is improving. The macro picture still looks quite rosy. But inflation is a big challenge that we see. The GDP numbers have come down, significantly from what we were expecting. Obviously, our aspirations are very high, and that should be. Government, do you think, has deep pockets now to spend aggressively? Sakshi, can you copy me? I think there is some technical issue with maybe Sakshi's network. I think our frame has been frozen. So, Indrajit, let me come to you meanwhile and take your view specifically on the SMEs and the MSME side. Uh, we have been talking a lot specifically to boost the credit specifically for the MSMEs and MSMEs. Is there anything specific that you think that the government should now do apart from what they have already done so that they can scale up the SMEs and MSMEs maybe and reach out to the next level?
Definitely. I really like this piece where our present generation enjoys that once in a lifetime moment. And these moments have been many in the last few decades for India. The present one is the China plus one moment. There is immense certainty that there will be large production houses made elsewhere in the world. And India is positioned right to be possibly the best one among all the alternatives. We have many in the Far East and South America, but India is really well placed. If we were to do this by giving confidence to our MSME sector that this is something we are going to invest in, it will take us several years, but it will be a definitive kind of a direction for India to take. Our last two terms, the government has done good work in this. We have got the Make in India already in play. Now is the time to actually ramp it up to yet another level to become the manufacturing hub of the world, not just India and a few other places. For that, the confidence has to be given for investing in capex, especially to the MSME, who are always cash starved, creating semi-urban employment, which will enhance rural spending, as I mentioned.
Right.
It will give a fillip to the spending across India and the flow through into all sectors around the MSME network. The second part is to boost basically the skill development to feed into the MSME sectors. You must have caught somewhere that Larsen and Toubro wanted to hire 40,000 skilled people, but they did not find 40,000 in one place. So they had to break it up into 3 different units. So right skilling is also very important. So when we have our ITIs and technical places, but it's a lot more than that. The skilling and upskilling of Bharat is going to be very important because that's where MSME is located. The last, slightly on a sources of funds, because all this is going to cost money, and Sakshi will soon tell us where the money is going to come from.
Right.
I suggest we have increased the Navratnas to 25 very recently in India. We also have some very well capitalized banks. We could actually divest these. It's a very good time in divestment. Last
Right.
year we had IPOs of 1.5 lakh crores. This year we are seeing IPOs of more than that. It's a good time in India to divest either part of the Navratnas or the 4 public sector banks, which I understand are in discussion. So that's where the source of funding for the MSME will come from. Back to you, Amol.
Okay, I think specifically on the diversification or disinvestment, a valid point in the Jeet, and I think sourcing of fund is also important aspect. Thanks for adding that. So Sakshi, let me come to you. I think we lost you because of the network. The question that I was trying to ask you is, as the macro picture looks quite rosy because of the GST collections and everything, still there are challenges because of the inflation, the GDP numbers are coming down. So the question that I have specifically for you is, do you think that the government have deep pockets to spend now? And if they want to spend, how will they spend? Indrajit said that you will give us some hint in terms of how government should spend, but please don't give suggestions in terms of adding more taxes, specifically on you and me. What could be the other ways, in fact, to spend? Yeah. So deep pockets has the government have, and how should they spend?
Sure. This is actually, I think, the center of the debate, right, for the budget and for, fiscal deliberations right now. Look, the good thing is that over the last, 4 or 5 years, government's revenue collection sources have improved, right? We have seen a number of, tax rationalization, the introduction of GST. I think collection of taxes has improved. So, you've also had the support from a higher RBI dividend, that has kind of come in. So, on the receipt side, or in terms of the, collection side, I do think that things have improved for the government in terms of the available sources of funds. Moreover, I think that, as the bond market in India, because that's another source where, the government kind of draws on to finance a lot of its expenditures. I think with the with the inclusion in the bond index, now you have a lot more sources of funding kind of accessible to you, right? So with a 14 or 15 lakh crore government borrowing program, there hasn't really been a problem in terms of, mobilizing resources. So I don't think that's a very big binding constraint. I would say that over the last 5 years, actually things have improved with a lot of the things that I just spoke about. The issue now is that what do you do with this money, right? You are working under this broad mandate of maintaining fiscal stability, which we discussed is very important, and we cannot jettison that. I mean, we are seeing the fallout of excessive fiscal spending or debt levels in countries like the US, right, where that tends to have an inflationary impact. It tends to have an impact on interest rates eventually in the market and bond yields. So therefore, fiscal prudence is definitely important. So working under that mandate, I think, given the growth context that you spoke about, right? Uh, while 6.5% growth is something that is achievable for in an economy the size of India, but the real challenge now is to start moving and sustaining growth above 7%, right? On a sustained basis, if we want to get to the targets of we spoke about the per capita income or overall income targets till 2030 or 2047. And for that, there are a couple of things that need to happen. A, I think in terms of the spending that the government brings about, I spoke about capital expenditure. I think there is still a lot of absorptive capacity in the economy in terms of the road infrastructure, logistics, now ports, very importantly, right, and really pushing some of these fundamental sectors in your economy, but at the same time starting to create a balance and starting to spend on some of the social aspects, which I think are becoming increasingly important if we want to really push our labor force to becoming more and more a productive resource. Indrajit sir spoke about skilling and the nature of quality of education, employment, etc. So for all these things, I think it is very important that A, there is focus, of course, and spending in terms of skilling. B, I think health is equally important to increase the productivity of your labor force, right? And third, very, very important, and I think India is now going through demographic changes, right? And I think there has to be a focus towards increasing women labor force participation. There is evidence from other economies that show that the incremental benefits or the growth that you see on GDP with each percentage share increase in women labor force participation is extremely beneficial and high, right? So I think the nature of this spending definitely is a focus area that the budget should focus on. One last point that I want to make is that if you look at India's, consumption story right now, what is really happening is that there's been a lot of traction and increase in demand at the top of the pyramid, right? We've been noticing that for a couple of years. there has actually also been improvement at the bottom of the pyramid, because the government
Yes.
has successfully been able to deliver on a lot of things,
Hmm.
sanitation, piped water, electricity, housing, roads. I mean, over the last 5 years, there's been an improvement in standard of living that ultimately leads to higher demand. But now I think there has to be some amount of focus on the middle, right?
Right.
Because this is the place where inflation has been biting, but at the
Hmm.
same time, income growth or wage growth hasn't
Hmm.
really kept up pace, right? And
Hmm.
that is what has started pinching overall consumer demand.
Right. I copy you. In fact, today itself, I wrote my Friday column dedicated to rural economy, and I spoke to so many people just to understand how the things are shaping up. And because of the infrastructure push, I think urban is getting connected with rural has made a big difference. But Sakshi, the biggest challenge now still remains with the rural is the job creation, because from the
Absolutely.
people from coming from rural to urban is still very challenging. And because the remuneration doesn't justify the cost of living in the urban areas. We'll speak partly on job in a while, but let me bring Raman here and learn more specifically on the financing part. So government has been trying to do whatever they can. In fact, during COVID also, they disbursed decent money specifically with the guarantee from the PSU banks and the banking sites for the SMEs and the micro and small businesses. Uh, what is it that maybe you think will actually push the credit really well, and will actually make a change for those small businesses? Because the banks, the NBFCs are still have their own challenges in terms of lending to the millions of perhaps the small businesses, Ramanji.
No, I think very valid point. So from the credit perspective, I would like to put in three key points here.
Mm, mm,
Foremost, see, Amal, what we need to appreciate is that every small borrower, small business suffers from a very high vulnerability of their cash flows,
mm,
which
mm,
could be, at any small event in the family, good or bad. It could be a
mm,
celebration in the family, it could be somebody falling sick in the family, or some natural calamity, and of course a pandemic like COVID
mm,
disrupts these cash flows the most.
mm,
Why saying is this is, I think there is a strong case here to rethink about, are we justified in having the same prudential norms for a small borrower borrowing few lakhs of rupees versus a large corporate borrowing 100 or 200 crores of rupees? Why are they
mm,
both treated prudentially as the same? Is there a case for bringing in some element of flexibility when it comes to MSME lending?
mm,
That's point number one. I think that's at the heart of a lot of issues which we face here. Even I would say, if you look at the rising stress in the mudra loans, is also one factor. That's another pointer. So
yes.
point number one is bringing in flexibility in lending to MSMEs.
Mm,
Number
mm,
two, of course, is something which I have been is very dear to my heart, and I think I really feel surprised, and I think it needs badly. You know, capital expenditure for MSMEs is a big ask.
I feel.
Any small time entrepreneur making a capital expenditure, be it for getting real estate or the machinery or whatever, is a big
Mm,
ask. And
mm,
that is where I think the whole idea, the whole model of leasing in India needs to be promoted very heavily.
mm,
Unfortunately, leasing in India has suffered heavily because of the taxation policies. And I
mm,
think we've seen world over that leasing is a very beautifully used tool to avoid capital expenditure and take care of the capital expenses of all small time entrepreneurs. So that's another point. I think leasing needs to be heavily promoted in India.
right.
And point number three, which is equally important, is giving a lot of stress and importance on the financial literacy of these small businesses.
Mm,
The way
mm,
they are able to present their credentials and financials is a very important element here. So I
mm.
think these three elements, if put together, can bring a sea change in how the credit can be delivered to this very important segment of the society.
I think that's a very, very valid point. In fact, very recently I was, reading a book which is written by the philosophy of Ant Financial by Alibaba, And he said that gone all those days where there will be only companies which will be made for billions of dollars, or only the billions of dollars companies. In fact, the digital world and the world in postmodernism will be all about the small companies. So I think that's where I think we need to support a lot to the SMEs and the MSMEs, because perhaps in the rural area, you do not need a $1 billion company, but $1 million company who could provide jobs and do a couple of things. So valid point, Ramanji. There, I have also started receiving a couple of questions. Friends, please be very, very specific. Couple of friends also wants to know the investment strategies. There are a couple of questions on the rapid industrializations and the energy security as well. I will come to that. But one question that I have for you, Inderjit ji, is specifically on the private capex. We have been talking a lot. We have been actually portraying India's macro picture really well, which is true in many sense, and hoping, in fact, the economy will double down in next 4 to 5 years. But the private companies or the private capex has still not picked up to the level which we wanted or maybe we expected. What do you think could be the reasons as a banker that you think? And if you could also give some sense in terms of what perhaps will push the private capex aggressively, because if that doesn't happen, perhaps there won't be major growth.
I think it's a very central question to India's story. The capex for the large companies is funded by large banks, and that flow, I think, is pretty intact. It's the MSMEs and the smaller companies where the capex is not necessarily available from banks, but private capex needs to come in. It's at this point, I'll come back to the point I touched upon, that there has to be some certainty. With the uncertain geopolitical landscape which is now evolving, a great amount of resilience will be required by India and comfort given to the MSMEs to invest in that capex so that they can have the production plans for the next 5 years and beyond. One of those is that certainty that India will become China plus one, that we are on a certain story to grow our in-home production juggernaut. The second will be that government will have to come up with some incentives, not necessarily in cash, but more in forms of insurance to these smaller companies in case of any resilience is required for the shocks which we just talked about. And as we all know, groups insurances are much cheaper to draw out than individual MSME insurances.
Right.
The second part is, how will the global dynamics evolve? I personally think that the Trump Republican Party coming back to power is a very big win-win for India.
Right.
All the good things which have been signed between India and America have always been through the Republican Party, whether it was 2 decades back or in the previous term. See, the China impact under Trump is likely to favor India. And that is where we must capitalize our MSME and invest in the private capex.
Right.
While countries become insular, all countries are becoming insular, we must understand that. But trade will go on because every country is short in some goods or some services everywhere. Like India is short on oil, the Western world is short on technology. They're short on manufacturing goods, which India can do. The last, of course, for the private capex is labor reforms. The investors have to be assured that the capex they're putting in will be handled by, adept and competent manpower who will actually deliver what they're funding. And that's availability of skilled labor, the relevance of the needs of that area. And, it should be something which can grow on a modular basis and can be scaled up very rapidly. We have the dividend of young youth. We've always talked of it as a dividend. In
Right.
Egypt, it went wrong. We have to learn from that and make sure that the Indian dividend of youth is channeled in the right channel, and huge gains are got by the country in the next 2 generations with
Right.
that, by skilling them right.
No, sure. I have a couple of questions. I think there is one common which question couple of people have asked is job that I will take slightly little later with all of you. But this question is specifically very simple but quite important one. Is what kind of strategy the government should have specifically for the Viksit Bharat, which we're talking about 2047? What should be the roadmap that the budget 2025 should disclose for the Viksit Bharat? Uh, Sakshi, you want to take this?
Yeah, sure. Just Amol, just before I get
Yeah.
into this, I just wanted to make one small point on your previous
Sure.
question around private,
Hmm.
capital expenditure and why that is not picking up, right? Of
Hmm.
course, um, y- y- you know, one additional element that we have to remember is that
Hmm.
for a lot of the large core sectors,
Hmm.
in India, where we have usually in the past, in the last 2 or 3 decades, we have seen huge private, participation on capex. A
Hmm.
lot of these sectors are actually now also undergoing a lot of excess capacity globally,
Right.
right? Which ultimately also limits,
Hmm.
how much fresh capacity and
Hmm.
visibility of demand, both domestic and external, right?
Right.
Private players could see. So that's something that's out of our control, right? But my fear is that going into the next 2 or 3 years,
Hmm.
as players like China, continue to slow down, and China is a very, very big producer, right? For instance, we are seeing in the steel segment, right? There is, of course, I think from the policy perspective, there can be some, I think, some policy focus towards protecting domestic players,
Hmm.
right, from some of this excess global capacity that is going on in certain segments and can increase, right? Because the Chinese economy is slowing down, but production there
Yes.
continues to be very high. So that's just one element on the private capex side that I wanted to highlight.
Hmm.
In terms of the roadmap for Viksit Bharat, now in the last budget speech, the FM did kind of set out some priorities, right?
Hmm.
In terms of their vision or roadmap of what is required for Viksit Bharat. Of course, that included, focusing on increasing agricultural productivity. I think
Hmm.
maintaining things like energy security,
Right.
moving into, the next gen reforms, capitalizing on a lot of the digital stack that you have
Hmm.
created in the economy.
Hmm.
Jobs, of course, is very, very, important. So there are a bunch of these issues. One thing that I think that we must start thinking about
Hmm.
now, um, is, and I don't think that it gets enough focus, is how India's demographics have now already started changing. And by
Hmm.
2047, although a large part of our workforce would still be, in the working age population, the share of people that will, be above 60 years of age will also start increasing. And if
Hmm.
you look at the patterns of the median age across India, right, they have already started changing. So in the south, they are already past their demographic peak,
Hmm.
right? So an aging population is
Hmm.
something that we have to think about, both from the perspective of what will be, um, the burden in terms of pensions, what will be the burden in terms of the, health, or the dependency ratio in your, economy. These are, I think, things from a very long term perspective that we need to start thinking about and planning for, now, and should be part of this Viksit Bharat, strategy. I mean, that's just an addition to what's already some of the things that have already been laid out.
Hmm. Sure, I think that is going to be the very, very key aspect. And we are not talking at all about aging population. In fact, I was recently reading a couple of reports which says that longevity has actually increased, which is a good sign. But the problem is then we have to find a job for people those who are even 70 and 80 years old, right? That's going to be a challenge because here millennials are also jobless. So that's a very interesting thought that you shared. Let me come to Raman and take more views specifically on the China Plus strategy. While we are trying to push SMEs and MSMEs or the small businesses in India, China has been very, very competitive. If I'm not wrong, in last budget or specifically the economic survey, the CEA has actually advised government to look at Chinese FDI far more seriously. I don't think that in last 7 to 8 months there has been any update on that. But China has been very competitive, and our small businesses are still suffering a lot. What kind of measures do you think will actually push small businesses, not only on specifically funding or a credit side, which we already discussed, but on a policy side? Because we are making India almost 10 years, it's been still there, but we haven't seen the micro businesses or the small businesses scaling up to SMEs, and SMEs scaling up to mid-sized businesses. That we have not seen. So what kind of policy change, Ramanji, do you expect to push those people and cross the boundary lines?
See, when we talk of China, we have to be very aware and careful about the fact that yes, as you said, I mean people were aware there were certain measures taken by the government, but if you look at now again, once again, we are witnessing an era of a lot of Chinese goods being dumped in India, and that is where I think the whole tariff structure is needs to be reviewed. Because if you are to promote the MSME segment, especially, this is some one major bottleneck which and major challenge faced by them. The moment
Right.
you see Chinese good flooding the Indian market, that is where you spell death knell for the small and medium enterprises. So I think a balance between the tariff in being imposed on the dumping of these goods versus, yes, as you rightly said, technology being coming in is a different aspect. I mean, that is something which needs to be certainly encouraged, that if there is a technology coming in and which helps the Indian entrepreneurs, fine. But what needs to be really looked at carefully is about this dumping factor which impacts our MSME. So I think that is where a great balancing act needs to be done by the government.
Sure, I think that's a valid point. Let me come to Indrajit, and one common question that I would like to shoot all of you, starting from Indrajit, is specifically on the job creation. Job has been the major challenge for the Indian economy. We just touched that topic some time back. The government also agrees the same factor, and they came with some schemes last year, specifically on the internship and the reskilling and the skilling part. But the companies wants to hire talent, but the skilled employees are not there. There are people who are ready to work, but the opportunities are not there. Indrajit ji, in your view, how can we resolve this problem? What can be done from a government level, from your company level, and overall India Inc. level?
Yeah, I think this is the core of the problem which the youth, and especially the youth in tier 2 and tier 3, are facing today. Um, you know, all the robust existing stalwarts in the Indian industry will have to rise to work with the government. It'll have to be a public private joint enterprise which we'll have to set up. There has been a scholarship scheme launched last year, and I've seen corporates subscribing with humble starts to that. Essentially, what I'm going to be talking about is that we'll have to have investment in the areas which are the hinterland for sourcing the right talent
Correct.
and using that talent in the same hinterland. I am the last person to transpose people from their towns into the cities or the metropolises of India. That, like you have rightly pointed out, Amol, is a very expensive place to stay, and the
Yes.
economics just doesn't stack up. So the upskilling of people has to be in their own hinterland, and companies led by the government will have to set up enterprise over there. And like Sakshi has rightly pointed out, half our labor force, half our workable, available labor force is women. And it is very underutilized both in the corporate world and in the private world. That is where we'll have to have a lot more trust, a lot more infrastructure given for them to actually come and work. Infrastructure of the nature of crashes, healthcare, insurances, and safety. It's a combination of many things. The countries in the Nordic regions have solved this problem very well. Even I think the US and Western Europe have solved it to a great extent. We definitely are lagging in this. So that is where the next wave of the skilled labor force will come from and work in the areas which they already are present. You know, when we do CSR work, we do humble amount of CSR. When we go into the hinterland, when we go deep into areas like Pench, inner recesses of West Bengal, Punjab, we find the eagerness to participate, but the channel is not yet available. And that will have to come from each individual firm, corporate, and government to work together to set up production hubs, MSMEs, and actually employ the persons here. You know, from outside, we all hear of the great Gujarat model. I
Hmm.
think it's a success because over there, no one is waiting for someone else to set up a small industry. They do it on their own. That is something which all of us will have to replicate around the country in measures. And from the government side, that safety net will have to come. The safety net of insurances for the family, the safety net of upskilling, and the safety net of job losses, which are covered by insurances again. So it'll be a tripod by which I think many of our minds, the four of us on this table, and several more will have to get together to put this infrastructure to start the path for the next 10, 20 years to get there.
Yeah, I think very, very meaningful in the GC. We should have a path for those many years, a long term. We should not think about just 1 or 2 years. Sakshi, do you also want to add here specifically on the job part? And maybe quickly, I also want you to answer this question, which someone called Rishi, who is the MD and CEO of GFI company, has asked: is how can India achieve energy security while transitioning to renewables to supply rapid industrialization? I know it's not specifically your domain, but if you could still try, as renewable energy is one of the economist dashboard item these days.
Right, right. So, I mean, I agree with what Inderjeet G said on the job front. It's a very complicated problem. We will need many many more hours of discussion to solve that. But just one thing I want to add there is, uh, you have this, I think greater push towards MSMEs, right? Will help solve at least the number of jobs or the absorptive capacity of the economy, right, at a particular skill level. Because MSMEs tend to be much more employment intensive, right, than other businesses. So when a small business wants to expand, the first thing it does is to hire one more person instead of setting up a factory or buying a lot of expensive machinery, right? So that kind of gives you a sense of how critical the MSME segment really is for solving this job problem. The second is, I think we should also now start kind of focusing on and enabling the gig workers. And this is a very big segment in your economy that is increasingly becoming larger and larger, right? There are a lot of people who are freelancing, and form a part of this gig or digital economy, right? And a lot of new kind of jobs that are coming up, right? And I think enabling these very small entrepreneurs or businesses or gig workers, I think can
Right.
also help, at least in the skilled segment. I think on the energy security front, I think there is good news. I think because in the renewable space, right, we have seen a lot of policy effort and traction also in terms of getting investments into India. So if you look at, just to kind of give you a sense, if you look at the amount of FDI flows, right, that India has been getting over the last 3 or 4 years, one of the sectors that has performed very well has actually been renewables.
Okay.
So there's been some amount of success, on that front. There have been schemes that the government has introduced, the solar panels, et cetera, that have been put into, place. So clearly that is one segment that, there is a lot of intent. There is a lot of policy initiative that has already happened. Of course, a lot more needs to be done. This is a very evolving space, right? The whole dealing with climate change, maintaining energy security, electric vehicles and adoption of that. I mean, all this kind of falls under this regime, but this is a very fast moving and evolving, space. So I don't
Great.
think we are, of course, there yet. But on this front, clearly, I do see from the policy side that there's been some traction in the positive direction.
No, sure. I think copy you. We have seen a lot of uptake specifically the renewable sides. The stocks in that segment are just flying high these days for sure, and we are seeing more EV vehicles on the road these days for sure. So noted your points and specifically on the job part as well. Ramanji, I want you to also add specifically on the jobs part, as this is an integral part of the India's economy and the growth story.
No, certainly. See, I think on the jobs part, let me extend the discussion what Indrajit ji talked about.
Mm.
Why? I mean, when he talked about using the skills of the youth at the local level. I would go a step further and why not think of developing micro hubs at the local level in terms
Mm.
of economic hubs, be it in manufacturing, be it in services. Use the local sources, use the local manpower, and develop hubs. So I think, for example, that idea of one district, one product is something, a step in that direction. So I think something of that needs a more of decentralization in that space is, I think, would serve a lot of good. That's one critical area we certainly need to look at. So I think that is one, I think, which I think needs to be certainly looked at. And on the energy part, renewable part, I think what we really need to now also focus is about getting that technology in India to start manufacturing. So, for example, photovoltaic cells, for example. So, getting that technology right now, we are excellent in using. We are getting into using more and more of solar power, wind power, and all that. But I
Mm.
think still that technology of manufacturing that thing in India is something which we need to also now look at and provide resources for that.
Mm. No, sure. I think that was again meaningful one. Let's hope government thinks about these lines and specifically focuses on jobs and the capex cycle and boosting the MSMEs and the small businesses, which are the integral part in the budget, which is going to be presented on the 1st of February. I will take a stop here and say thank you to all of you for sharing such a meaningful thoughts on this particular show and being part of ETBFSI budget series. So thank you from Manji, Indrajit ji, and Sakshi for sharing those relevant and the realistic thoughts here on this particular platform. Thank you so much.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And friends, see you next Friday at 3 o'clock with Budget Expectations, a dedicated episode of ETBFSI. Thank you.
We can, thanks Amol. We can log
Yes,
off.
yes. We
Okay.
can. We can log
Thank
off.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you, Sakshi.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amol. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.